Hello YouTube, welcome back to EmpireofPrints. Today we're going to be making a Phase 2 realistic Commander Fox helmet. I have all the parts printed here, and just for starters, this file is a paid file from Galactic Armory. Go check them out. All the parts are separated super nicely. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to tape everything together, get it in the format I want, and then we're going to take our plastic welder and weld everything together. So let's go do that. So here we are with the tape on both sides. I personally like to tape them just because it keeps the parts aligned, because if these parts misalign, you're going to have a ton of sanding and it's not going to look right, as well as you're not going to be able to get these parts separated. I mean, once you weld them together, it's a pretty permanent fix. They're going to be stuck together. And just make sure you're wearing a proper PPE mask, a respirator. You do not want to inhale this stuff in. It is extremely toxic. Before I was able to put the dome on, I had to take an X-Acto blade because I had some very weird support attachments and it was very rough. So in order for it to sit flush, you kind of just want to graze it over those supports or any rough areas that might be uneven, because we want this thing to sit as flush as possible. It's going to save us a ton of sanding and filler, and we already have a lot of that. After we have the dome attached, I realized I had some more rough support attachment areas, so I'm just doing the exact same thing as the dome, and I'm just grazing over those rough areas. Just going to save us a good chunk of sanding. Now moving on to my first step in my sanding process, I am taking an 80 grit sandpaper pad with a mouse sander, and I'm just going to kind of do a rough sand over the entire helmet. This will get about 80% of the lines out. You're not going to get in the nooks and crannies. There's still going to be some hand sanding, but just kind of get the larger areas and the rougher spots. This is going to do a lot of the work for you and save you a ton of primer. Same thing here with the visor, just taking an 80 grit sandpaper pad, kind of roughing over all those large areas, anywhere I can reach with the mouse sander. Just be careful not to sit in the same spot too long. You will burn through and warp the plastic, so just be aware of that when you're sanding. Now that the 80 grit sand is done with the mouse sander, we're gonna move on and switch pads to a 220 grit. Just trying to smooth this all out because this is very rough, and then we'll come in with some 220 and hand sand all the hard to reach areas. So we'll get that started. With sanding the 220 grit with the mouse sander, we're not trying to get any of the layer lines out. We're purely just trying to smooth this thing out. It's going to make primer and sanding a little bit easier, so we have less smoothing to do. With Commander Fox, he has a couple accessory pieces, one being this antenna, and unfortunately, more sanding. We have to hand sand this thing. I do not currently have a resin printer, so I'm painfully hand sanding all these small bits. But with a 220 grit pad and bump up your printer quality settings, you can get this thing pretty smooth in a couple passes. Before we put on any primer, I like to do a Bondo acetone glaze. I prefer a watery consistency. I like it very thin. I don't want it too thick. It's just going to be a lot harder to sand. Most people recommend a milky consistency, but a water consistency I think does a much better job. So you just want to mix this up and glaze it over the whole helmet. We're just doing a quick first layer, and then we're going to wet sand it with some 400 grit. After our first layer of Bondo and acetone, we are going to take a 400 grit and we're just going to wet sand the entire helmet. I like to wet sand. It's just less dust and cleanup. I also only use a 400 grit sandpaper pad. You don't really need anything lower than that in my opinion. This stuff sands really easy and it's really fast to just burn right back down to the plastic. So just be aware that when you're doing your wet sand, you'll kind of see the plastic color poking through. That's okay because we are doing another layer of this, so don't be too concerned about it. After drying the helmet from our wet sand, I just do one more layer of the Bondo acetone, getting that watery glaze consistency. And then after this, we'll just move into a 400 grit wet sand and the helmet should be all ready for primer. For the fin on the top of the dome, I take the glaze and I just pack down a little bit extra of the glaze. This helps fill in those deeper layer lines and saves you some sanding. Once our second layer of Bondo has been sanded, I move on to some primer. I use Rust-Oleum filler primer. I think this stuff works great, really fills in those smaller imperfections. I don't recommend the 2-in-1 as it kind of clogs up your sandpaper and I feel like it never really dries properly. So I just recommend the normal filler primer. This stuff works great. After our primer has dried, I just take some 400 grit and I wet sand the whole helmet. This is a very rinse and repeat process. You kind of just sand it, primer it until you're happy with how it looks, until you got most of the imperfections out. There's no avoiding hand sanding, so get used to it. We're going to be doing a lot of this. So here, I know the helmet is not ready for paint. I just wanted to give it a base coat of white so I can really see the imperfections. I recommend doing this towards the end of your build. It really shows any issues you might have and shows where you might need to sand a little bit more, and then we'll go back to sanding. This is why the white paint's good when you're towards the end of your build process. I could obviously see I needed way more filler on some areas, especially the brow line and around the fin area and the cheek area. I just didn't sand enough, so it was a little bit rougher than I wanted. So we'll put on some filler primer and we'll go back to sanding. After the primer is dried and added a little bit of Bondo in a couple areas, I just did one final 400 grit wet sand over the whole thing and it was ready for its final coat of white paint. Moving on to the taping process, I'm just using some frog tape. This stuff gives me really clean lines. As long as you secure it nice and flat, this stuff is great. And make sure you have a brand new sharp X-Acto blade, because sometimes you're going to over tape or you need to round off an edge, and an X-Acto blade is super helpful for that. For the lines on the front of Commander Fox's helmet, same process here. I just take some frog tape to cover up where I wanted it to stay white after painting the red. And I pretty much just estimated the length and the width of each line and then hand put each one on, kind of estimating the evenness on both sides. When applying the paint, I just used some Vallejo Dark Vermilion. I think this was a really close match to what we see in the Clone Wars and even a little bit what we see in the Shock Troopers in Revenge of the Sith. I just airbrushed this on. It's only my third time using an airbrush, so I did encounter quite a bit of clogging and other issues. Same thing with the visor. I'm just using some Folk Art matte black paint. This is pretty cheap acrylic paint, but worked pretty good right out of my airbrush. And you just want to spray the whole thing, including the inside of the visor, because you will see the inside of the visor. So just make sure you get a nice coat of black in there as well. Once the red paint was all dried up and I was comfortable handling it, I take an X-Acto blade to lift up the edges of the tape to pull it off. You want to use an X-Acto blade and not your finger, because you will very easily scratch the airbrush paint up. So just be mindful of that and make sure to pull the tape off nice and slow. I went a little fast in some parts when pulling off the tape and actually ripped up some of the white paint. So just be mindful of that when you're pulling off the tape. For the details, I always recommend just hand painting them. I think it's much faster to just hand paint like the brow and the frown area. Just make sure you really water down your paint so you don't get any brush strokes. So unfortunately, I accidentally had some leakage from the frown when I painted it gray. I don't think I secured the tape properly, and I think there were some gaps that peeled up, which is why it leaked. So you just want to take an X-Acto blade and very lightly just graze over those leakage areas. You'll scrape them right off, and if there is any left over, it's very easy to cover up in weathering. For the greeblies, I just did the same thing I did with the antenna and painfully hand sanded each one with some 220 grit and hit it with some filler primer, and it was all ready for some paint. After I painted the greeblies, I went on to painting the white stripe along the visor. Once again, just taking some prog tape and some white paint and did a few coats of white paint to get a nice solid line. For the first step of my weathering process, I like to go over all the high points with an X-Acto knife, as well as doing randomized scratches, large, small, different angles. Just make sure each one is kind of in a different direction. You want everything to be as randomized as possible when you're doing this process, and make sure to go very light so you don't dig through the paint. Before I start the weather wash, I like to glue on all the greeblies. This is just going to be much easier, especially when we get into our dry brushing later. I also almost forgot, we do have to paint these stripes on either side black. I don't think there's a good way at all to paint these lines. They are so tedious to do. It's almost impossible to get these things perfect. So I just went over it as best I could because I knew in the weathering process I'd be able to cover it up pretty easily. After I painted the lines, I moved on to my weather wash, which is just some cheap acrylic paints. I use apple barrel and I just mix it to get the color of motor oil, and I just wipe this over the entirety of the helmet, really get it in those nooks and crannies, and then I take a damp paper towel and kind of just dab it off. Make sure not to rub in the same direction because you will get streaks and it will look very unnatural and it won't look very realistic with the weathering. So here I'm going for a really weathered look with the antenna. I wanted some rust buildup around the edges and the crevices of the antenna, and I got this technique over from Brunger Builds. Go check them out. It's a really great technique where you just use some Mod Podge, water down with some water, and then some pastel chalks. And here I'm just using this brownish orange, kind of looked like a rust color, and I'm just scraping it into the crevices. This gives a really nice dusty build-up look of dirt, and even if you scrape off enough of it, it builds up and has like a texture to it, almost like a peeling rust effect, and I think it looks great. For the visor, I just did the same thing in the center portion right here, and then around the bottom attachments where it clicks on the helmet. Just that same rusty colored chalk, kind of just wiping it in with my finger, occasionally scraping some dust in so it gives it a nice textured look to it. For the vents, I went for a more brownish chalk where I just scrape in some Mod Podge and then scrape off dust directly into the vents and then dab it in with the brush, wiping away all the excess with the paper towel. This works great, really builds up that nice textured look, and it kind of covers up any of the imperfections I had when painting the lines. And then for here, on the greebly portions, I went back to that orangey rust and kind of just dabbed it around using my finger and paper towel. Both work great. For all the crevices around the ears, the cheek, as well as these back portions, I just mix some Mod Podge with a little bit of water to make this brown chalk wash, and I just buried it in the crevices with my finger. It gives that really nice realistic buildup where these spots are going to be harder to clean, harder to reach, so they're going to be more built up over time and really show that dirt. Lastly, I'm just rusting up this little back portion back here with some of that orange chalk again, just dabbing it away with my finger and a paper towel. I go for a really dirty, weathered look on all my helmets. These guys fought for years, like I say, from ship to ship, planet to planet. They were all over the place. They were extremely dirty. Even on Coruscant, I know Commander Fox saw less action, but it's a huge city. It's full of dirt, grime. They're in the sewer sometimes. So I like to really show that buildup. It shows it really realistic. It tells a story. In a rush to get this video out, I forgot to record me putting in the visor, but it's just a Hobart face shield, and then I take some metal chicken wire mesh to put behind the mouth, and then it's just adding the details like the flashlight and the antenna as well as the visor, and this helmet is all ready to be shown off. If you have made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe. I'll be uploading a new one like this every week, and there's plenty more to come. See you in the next one.